In this video we're going to discuss how the pawn moves in a game of chess and the rules with pawns and so on. It's important to know that a pawn moves basically in a straight line. And so you can see here I'm demonstrating that this pawn is moving in a straight line up the board towards the black pieces. Now the first time a pawn moves, it can move one square or two squares. So the first move that I was demonstrating here was pawn to f4. Please note, pawn to f4 is we have this square f4 and the pawn has moved to f4. So you'll hear chess players say things like pawn to f4. They're just kind of stating the move that they're making. So pawn to f4. Now for the black pieces I'm going to play the move pawn to e6. Now remember, pawns move in a straight line. A pawn to e6, if you can find that e6 square on the board, it's this square, I'm telling you that I'm going to move a pawn to that square. Since they move in a straight line, this is the pawn that would have to move there. So pawn to e6, that move would look like this. So that's all great. Pawns move in a straight line, but we need to understand that the first time that they move in a game, and I'm going to reset the board position, the first time they move in a game, they have the option to move either one square forward or two squares forward if they're going to advance. Now it's different if they're going to capture a piece, but I'll cover that in a little bit. So a pawn can move one or two squares. So this pawn moves two. They chose to move two the first time, where the black pieces chose to move their pawn only one square this time. So two spaces or one moving forward. I'm going to move another pawn, a white pawn to e4. See if you can visualize that move. Pawn to e4. It's going to look like this. And for the black pieces I'm going to play pawn to d5. See if you can signify or see where that's going to go. Pawn to d5. Now this position in the game provides the first opportunity for me to talk about how a pawn captures a piece. If pawns are going to capture a piece, they are required to capture a piece that is directly diagonal to them. And so you can see here I'm signifying that the white pawn on e4 has the option to capture the black pawn on d5. So the pawn on e4 actually has two options. If the player wants to pick, the pawn on e4 can choose to move forward one space. Now remember, it would have to move forward one space. It no longer has the option to move two because it's already moved. Or it also has the option to attack the pawn on d5, the one diagonal from it. So capturing is done diagonally and only diagonally, and it has to be directly diagonally. It can't be two spaces away or so on. So in this game I'm going to continue to move pieces, and in this case I am going to have the pawn capture pawn, which by the way then puts the black pieces into a decision mode, because guess what? The pawn on e6 has the opportunity to capture that white pawn on d5 because it's diagonally. So they have that option, or of course they could move forward, or they don't have to move at all. That's really their options. So in this game, the black pawn is going to capture the white pawn. Alright, now we're going to go through some more moves. The next move I'm going to play is pawn to b4, and as I state these moves I'd recommend that you try to visualize them before I move them. Pawn to b4, because the white pieces has that option. It's the first time the pawn ever moved. It could move two squares forward if it wants. Black is going to move pawn to f5. White is going to move pawn to b5, so they advance their pawn one square. Now note, they can only move one square at this point because it already started the game. And on the black is going to move pawn to h5, so they're going to choose to move two squares on that one. White decides to play pawn to g4, two squares. And now the black pawns have really some options here. Of course they could move a pawn, but note they have two different pawns that are able to attack that white pawn, because pawns attack diagonally. That's how they capture pieces. So black has the option to really capture that pawn with either of their pawns that they want to. They don't have to capture, but if they want to, they get to pick which one. So the black pieces choose to capture with their h-pawn, the pawn on the h file. So they capture. White decides to play d3, pawn to d3. And black is going to play pawn to a5. Now, we need to talk about the move pawn to a5. A lot of people who think they know how to play chess and they know how the pieces move, and maybe you're even watching this video and saying, yeah, I know how pawns move. Well, a lot of people who just play chess for fun don't understand that there's a special rule that actually just occurred in this game. Okay, it's very, very important to understand that if a pawn chooses to move 2 squares its first move, and at the same time it happened to move through a square where a pawn could have captured it while it was moving, the white pawn is allowed to capture that pawn as it passes through. In fact, it's allowed to capture the black pawn in passing while it's passing through. And actually in English it is in passing. However, the correct chess term is called en passant. En passant means in passing, and that's actually what has happened here. As the rules morph over time in chess, pawns were given the ability to move 2 squares when in fact originally they were only given the ability to move 1. And so what occurs in this game is the black pieces plays pawn to a5, but the white pawn decides to capture. This is a legal move. It is called en passant. It's valid. They can capture that pawn, as you can see just happened in this board. That catches many beginner players off guard because they have never studied or heard of en passant. And you should be aware of that rule. It is not cheating. It is valid. Now, after the white pawn captures, it looks like there is a black pawn that now has the opportunity to capture back because it is a diagonal attack there, and so black decides I'm going to capture that pawn there. And I'll continue this game now, and white is going to play a move h4, and there we have it again. This is a special circumstance where en passant applies. It's crucial to realize what white has just done. White has just moved 2 squares because it was the first time the pawn moved. In doing so, they have passed through a square where another pawn could have taken it. And therefore, the black pawn is allowed to capture, as if the white pawn is actually sitting on this square, this h3 square. Now, it's very important to understand that the en passant rule applies, but if the black pieces wants to capture that white pawn, it is required to do so right now. So let me step back here. If white makes this move again, white plays h4. It's now black's turn. If black chooses to take that pawn, like we've been discussing by en passant, it is allowed to, but it must do it on this turn and this turn only. If black decides to move a different pawn, it will never be able to take by en passant. We just have to realize that it has to be done at that moment, or it cannot be done at all. So, in this game, the black pawn does decide to capture en passant. So it is going to capture, and the white pawn is going to disappear. The next move by white is pawn to a4, and black plays pawn to h2. White decides to play pawn to a5, and the next move we have is another special rule for chess, another special rule with pawns. There's a lot of special rules with pawns that you need to master. This rule states that if you get your pawn to the opposite end of the board, you can turn it into any piece you want. You just cannot turn it into a king, because you can't have 2 kings on the board. But you can choose any piece you want. Now, most people choose a queen, but I can tell you that's not always the best option, but most of the time it seems as the logical option is to take the queen. So when a pawn reaches the end of the board, reaches the other end of the board, it is promoted to a higher piece, which is why this would be called promotion. Promotion is when a pawn gets to the other side and becomes another piece. It is promoted to a higher level. You can think of it that way. And so black chooses to do that. Black chooses to move the pawn to h1 and promotes it to a queen. So now black suddenly has a new queen on the board, which makes them a lot stronger. Now, for the sake of this lesson, since this lesson is on pawns, I'm not going to be moving that queen at all. I'm just going to continue with the pawn moves. So white plays pawn to c4, putting it into a position where it is under attack. Black decides to take that with their pawn, so they'll capture on c4. And now white can do the same. White takes back with their pawn. And so you can see that pawns are taking diagonally. They're moving forward but taking diagonally. That's a very key concept. Move forward, take diagonal. Black decides to play pawn to g5. White decides to capture diagonally. Black plays pawn to f4. White plays pawn to g6, and now it's a foot race. Black advances their pawn, white advances their pawn. Black advances their pawn, and now white is in the position where they are going to be able to promote their pawn. They're going to be able to make the move pawn to g8, and that's going to be involve promotion, where this pawn can become any other piece it wants to other than a king, and it can't stay a pawn, because pawns, if it stayed a pawn, it wouldn't be able to move at all, because pawns can only move forward down the board. So once a pawn reaches the other side, you really need to convert it into either a queen, a rook, a bishop, or a knight. And so white chooses to do that. White chooses to advance their pawn, promote their pawn, and they decide to turn theirs into a queen also. Now black has a second promotion move where they can advance their f-pawn and promote their f-pawn, of which they choose to do, and they turn that into a queen. Now, I would highly caution you to making a goal to getting a lot of queens, because it leads to an issue later called stalemate, which is I'll make a different video on stalemate. But time and time again, I see players get greedy who think, hey, I'm going to go get 5 queens against my opponent. Well, I'll be honest with you, a lot of times they don't win the game because they end up in a stalemating position. And by short definition, a stalemate ends up being a draw or a tie. But again, I'll make a video on that later. So I'll finish this up quickly here with a couple more moves. White plays pawn to c5, and black plays pawn to c6. Now, I'm not going to move queens, so I'm going to talk about the pawn positions here. When looking at these pawns, remember, pawns can only move forward, so right now it's white to move, and they'd have to move the white pawn forward. They can't. There's a black pawn blocking it. They could try moving the other white pawn forward. They can't. There's a black pawn blocking it. So these two pawns are really stuck. In fact, both the white pawns and both the black pawns are stuck there. And they are not going to be able to move at all unless they can find some way to be able to capture a piece diagonally, and there's nothing there to capture right now. And the same with the A pawn. The only way that these white pawns can move the rest of the game is if they clear away in front of them, or if they're allowed to capture a piece diagonally. At this point in time, they can't. So the pawns that I have sitting on the board right now cannot move. My demonstration for pawns is pretty much over. It's important to understand. On its first move, and its first move only, the pawn has the option to move forward 1 or forward 2. And of course it can capture diagonally on its first move if that's an option. We have to remember en passant, the special rule in passing, where a pawn can actually capture diagonally as something passes through, and it can only be pawns. Pawns capture pawns in en passant. That's it. You cannot en passant other pieces. And then remember promotion. Promotion is where a pawn gets to the other side of the board and it can become any other piece it wants besides another pawn or a king. I hope that helps you understand a little bit about how pawns operate in a game. Good luck to you.